text that we'll be looking at so that you can see the screen. That will be the focus of our study. Whoop. Don't need to have the captions or audio in the background of myself. Down that way lies madness. Very, very difficult to hear myself speak as an echo. It's true for most humans, from what I understand, and our neurological limits. Okay, so we'll just give it a few more seconds for everyone to log in, and then we will get down to work. If you want to start flipping ahead, we are in Devarim 28, also known as Deuteronomy 28, and we're going to be looking at verse 15 to start, and then we'll read a chunk, and well, I imagine there'll be much that we feel and need to talk about. At least that's my expectation. All right, it is the official 12:01 start that we normally set for ourselves. YouTube seems to be working just fine. So hopefully those that are trying to join through that have already got their notification and can do so. But let's get down to work. We're picking up in mid-chapter, as is often the case, because we can't ever spend enough time to cover the entire parasha with anything like the amount of detail or thoughtfulness that it deserves. So rather than simply reading to you superficially what you could read by yourself, I always try to pick a selection that you can then read together with me in more depth, more reflection, and hopefully that will encourage, inspire, and guide you to read the other portions privately. But sometimes it's a little hard to pick it up mid-thought. So just a very brief introduction from the earlier part of chapter 28. We are now at the threshold of the land of Israel. We are standing, waiting to enter what we have been yearning for 40 years. And God has asked Moses to explain to the people that there are blessings that await us there and for the future that are wonderful, that are beautiful, that are of great satisfaction to anyone who reads them. That's the beginning part of chapter 28. Chapter 28, verse 15 onwards, is the other side of the coin, that there are also what are referred to as curses. Now, we're going to talk about that word curse more, but for the moment, let's just translate that as being bad stuff, that there is bad stuff. And at the beginning, right here in verse 15, it's going to start off with what appears to be a conditional phrase, which on the surface is definitely encouraging us to imagine that the choice between the blessings at the top of the chapter and the curses that dominate the rest, that is entirely up to us. And we are going to have to, well, examine what happens, but also examine whether or not that surface reading is the most accurate, the most helpful, and of course, the most intended reading. Because after all, bad stuff, well, that seems to happen in ways that don't always make sense to us. So let's see whether or not that superficial reading can withstand a little bit of scrutiny. So we're going to pick up here, verse 15, and we'll see how far we get before we need to take a break from the trauma of the curses and then get into some sort of discussion. But it shall be, if you do not hearken to the voice of Adonai your God, by taking care and by observing all his commandments and his laws that I command you today, then there will come upon you all of these curses and overtake you. So that is the introductory phrase, the preamble, if you will. And it seems to be laying out that we need to be obedient to Torah. We need to follow the instructions, the commandments, etc. And if we don't, then these other curses will eventually become our fate. And let's see what those are. We begin first with a parallel structure to the early section of chapter 28. Cursed be you in the town, damned be you in the open field, or also cursed. Fox breaking one of his own rules here of not using a different word for in English for the same word in Hebrew. Cursed be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed be the fruit of your womb, meaning children, and the fruit of your land, the offspring of your cattle and the fecundity of your sheep. Cursed be you in your coming, and damned be you in your going out. Again, cursed in your going out might be a more direct translation. Adonai will send forth against you curse, bewilderment, and reproach. All right, now we're getting into details rather than the general statements. Against all the enterprises of your hand that you do, until you are wiped out, until you perish quickly because of the evil of your deeds by which you have abandoned me. So already perhaps we are getting an inkling that this description is not entirely going to be easy to pin down. After all, we know that Israel has suffered numerous catastrophes in both biblical and post-biblical time, but none of them have wiped us out. None of them have caused us to perish. Or is this meant not as a group, but as an individual? How are we meant to take this? After all, the language is given as an individual pronoun, but that could be because God is speaking to the group. Surely we're not expecting every individual to have the level of specificity that the rest of these curses will need. It would have to be upon an entire group. But if it's upon an entire group, then have these curses ever come true? Certainly, much of what we've just described has occurred at different times, and yet the fullness of it, the idea that we have been wiped out, well, hi, we're still here. So that has not occurred. Does that mean this is part of the future or the past? We can still begin to realize that maybe there is more to this than that initial black and white. If you do good, you will have good. If you do bad, you will have bad. Let's continue with the disasters as described. Adonai will make the pestilence cling to you until it has finished you off from the land that you are entering to possess. Adonai will strike you with consumption, with another type of disease, with fever and with inflammation, with violent fever and with dehydration, with blight and with jaundice, and they will pursue you until you perish. The heavens that are above your head will become bronze, and the earth that is beneath you iron. The simplest way to understand this is that when the heavens become bronze, it means there is no life-giving rain coming from the sky. It's as though it were iron and thus preventing, bronze is thus preventing. It's think of the bright noonday sun that is baking the world around you with no respite when you need the water, and thus the earth becomes hard as iron because of that lack of moisture. And that is borne out in verse 24. Adonai will make the rain of your land powder and dust. From the heavens it will come down upon you until you are wiped out. Dust storms, perhaps, or just the general dust bowl that comes from a severe drought condition. And then moving on to the issue of war. So we've done disease, we've done drought, now we're moving to war in 25. Adonai will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. By one road you will go out against them, meaning as a group, as a cohort, as a battalion of soldiers organized and ready. But by 7 roads will you flee before them, complete panic and retreat. You will become an object of fright to all the kingdoms of the earth. That is to say, what happens to us will become in the eyes of other as a watchword for what catastrophe might befall. The same way that we still use the phrase Pyrrhic victory to refer back to the ancient battle, we would be used as a byword for others. Your corpse will be for eating for all the birds of the heavens and for the beasts of the earth, with none to make them tremble. So not even our bodies will be gathered, and it will be such a total disaster that there won't even be anybody to chase off the birds or to cast a rock at the animals that are trying to eat the corpses, that they will do it with complete peace and sense of security, which is obviously what has been completely removed from us. Now, the rest of the parasha goes on in this way. There are many more curses and details of destruction. It gets only darker and only worse from here on out. This is such a crushing passage to read that by tradition, we always make sure that this is one contiguous reading. We do not have multiple people called up for the blessing of the Torah during this. So it just is one long dirge, if you will, in order to both get it over with and also not to burden anyone else more than one person necessary for hearing the curses while they are called at the Torah. It's not considered the most auspicious aliyah to receive, and so we wouldn't want to divide that up more than necessary. All right. Now, how do we handle this? Well, there are many different questions, some of which I've already touched on. Do we look at this as presaging what will happen in the times of the Assyrians, what will happen in the times of the Babylonians? Do we look at this as being talking about times that are post-biblical, that this is looking at times for during the Roman conquest, during the Hashmonean struggle when the Maccabees were fighting back against the Seleucid Empire? Well, those are great questions, but not the focus for today. Because the focus for today is on the deeper question that I think troubles people more than the historical placement of these particular acts. And that is the question of, is this fair? Is this right? After all, God has said, apparently, back in verse 15, that this is only going to happen if we do not listen to the Torah, if we do not keep the commandments, if we are not careful in our ways. So on the surface, it would seem, of course, it's going to be fair. We were given the option not to have these things happen to us, and that option just meant obedience. And so if it's happening, we must deserve it. And that seems pretty cut and dry. However, many people are uncomfortable with that level of, shall we say, satisfaction with this, because it doesn't seem to be an accurate depiction of our assessment of the world around us. Most notably, bad things like this seem to happen to good people, that someone could be observant of Torah, a pious person, but more a good person, a righteous person, honest and upright and helpful to the community, and yet they could be caught up in the whirlwind of this type of disaster. When there is a war, the enemy soldiers don't normally ask, all right, who among you was actually a good person? Don't worry, we're not going to harm you. We're only here for the bad ones. Usually in war, soldiers of both sides kill each other without checking the morality of their victim. It is kill or be killed in war, after all. And so we don't see this as being necessarily fair. Likewise, the drought that will hit my wicked neighbor's farm is likely going to be hitting my farm as well. Very rarely would you imagine the rain to fall only on my acres, but not on theirs. And disease, as we all know, far too painfully, seems to be quite indiscriminate in who it chooses as its target. And so if these curses are truly entirely within our hands, then what are we dealing with here? Is this blaming the victims for their suffering? Are we saying that all who suffer deserve exactly what they are suffering from? Well, those are some of the questions that we have been wrestling with for a few thousand years, but I wanted to bring just two opinions today. Well, one that contains many other layers, which is always helpful for me when I can find a source text that will present alternative views within itself. But hopefully it will at least spark the beginning of a conversation. After all, we are coming up to the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, and following that, Yom Kippur, when we are meant to be thinking about our destiny, our fate, our future. We are meant to be thinking about the implications of our behavior, of our choices. We are fully seized of the power that God has given us to determine our destiny. And yet, we also may feel that the destiny we are receiving so far is unfair. Despite what Unatana Tokef says, where it seems like we are being simply measured underneath the shepherd's staff to be decided for the decision of who will live and who will die, it doesn't always feel like who's getting to live and who's getting to die, who's rising up and who's being brought low, is being done with a sense of fairness that is at all comprehensible to us, if not completely at odds with what we believe a just world should look like. So to go into Rosh Hashanah, to go into Yom Kippur, we need to have a better understanding of this. Not all the answers. Like I said, we've been still wrestling with this for 3,000 years, but at least something a bit deeper than that very superficial understanding. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and begin with the words of Rabbi Sachs. This is the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, and was somebody who was often very good at bringing together multiple sources from our tradition and making them perhaps more available and understandable. While I disagree with him on many points, and especially in his service to the broader UK Jewish community, happy to talk about that privately with anyone who's curious. His popularization, his ability to bring elements of our faith and our tradition to light that many people who were not engaged in study would never have come across is very much a good accomplishment. So this is a section from his book which entirely deals with this topic of catastrophe and crisis and comfort and how we deal with it. So obviously he has much more to say about this, as you'll see, not all of which I agree with, but hopefully his marshaling of the sources will at least give us a springboard for trying to move our own understanding and our own discussion forward. The traditional categories of punishment, sin, and atonement came under increasing strain as the full implications of the final solution began to dawn on Jews. So this is taken from the section of his book that deals specifically with the crisis of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, that just using the normal language of, well, there's sin, and that means punishment, and we do sacrifice, and then there's atonement, that seemed to be stretched, that it didn't feel like you could move that idea wide enough to cover the absolute horror that was taking place during the Holocaust. And so now he'll catalog some different responses. One writer reports a searing debate that took place in a synagogue in the ghetto on the eve of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. As the cantor pronounced the blessing, who has kept us alive and sustained us and brought us to this time, which is the translation of the Shehechianu, where we are thanking God for letting us reach this moment, a pious Jew began to cry, lies, lies, it is all lies. So a man who was, and his community considered to be a pious, believing member of that community, can't conscience that. He says, you can't, how could you say, thank you, God, for keeping us alive for this? The very words are a lie under these circumstances. A lapsed Jew, that is to say, a former yeshiva student who had become an atheist, stood up and replied, Jew, you know that I was a blasphemer, a mocker of Israel, a lost soul. And I tell you, yes, there is a God in heaven. So we have this other Jew, and in very typical Jewish fashion, we're having an argument in the middle of a service, and this Jew, who was somebody who had become an atheist, is actually reaching back towards their faith during this time and saying that, as a matter of fact, the current circumstances make them believe more strongly in God rather than rejecting God as the more religious Jew had just claimed. So he explains, here, meaning during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, we have seen fulfilled the words of the prophets and their curses, all of which have fallen on us. He opened to the Torah and read from our Torah portion, and it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, to take care to fulfill all his commandments and his statutes, which I command you this day, that all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. All right, so the argument from the lapsed Jew is a more superficial reading of our text, which is, hey, we deserved it, right? I mean, speaking as somebody who was an atheist, he says, as somebody who had been told all about Judaism as a young man and then rejected it, I can tell you, we earned this. This is exactly what God was talking about back in Deuteronomy. And what did you expect? That we would not be punished? Of course. The pious Jew, however, replies, my teachers, meaning to the other learned members of the community, you have heard that God destroys his people because of their sins. Isn't it foolish to believe that? If this were a punishment from heaven because of our sins, why did all the rabbis, the pure and holy righteous ones who were full of Torah and good deeds, why did they die? So he is talking about his own crisis of faith because this disaster of the Holocaust hurt people, whether they were lapsed Jews or whether they were pious rabbis, whether they were the most honest and upright and Torah-abiding person in the world, or whether they were the most unrepentant sinner. It does not feel like that curse fell proportional and directed at those who actually deserved it. It feels like it hit everyone. And sure, the lapsed Jew may feel like he deserves it, but in the eyes of the more pious Jew, how dare he accuse all the others that have died in the Holocaust of deserving what happened to them? Because certainly they did not. They were keeping Torah. They were living a devoted, committed, serious Jewish life, and yet they were also destroyed. And that, to this scale, does not seem in keeping with God's justice. And as such, the pious Jew is crying out, lies, lies. This, we can't believe what we've been told if this is what is happening. Now, before we continue, I just want to give a little bit of room for the understanding and discussion. I know much of this conversation will make many people very uncomfortable. Good, you should be, because you can't be truly comfortable until you've actually confronted these issues. But recognize that what the pious Jew may be attacking is not necessarily God's self, but instead the understanding of God that had been prevalent up till that point. That is to say, the understanding of the so-called lapsed Jew, somebody who was steeped in tradition from that generation, his understanding might be what is targeted as the lie. That perhaps we have been misunderstanding God and justice and the world. Perhaps we have lived with too simplistic an understanding that only the wicked would ever be destroyed. And that is what is the shock to us today. And to say that this is all perfectly fine and in keeping with the justice that we think we understand, that could be a huge problem. And indeed, we're going to see from some of the other voices in Rabbi Sachs's text here that many people do take that label or do take that approach and of the approach that we're labeling in that superficial way and go to places that we probably don't agree with. Let's go ahead and continue with this discussion in the voice of others and in Rabbi Sachs's reflections. It was not only that divine punishment failed to explain the deaths of the innocent, the children, the righteous. It also pointed in contradictory directions, meaning just saying, oh, it's divine punishment seems perfectly fine until you realize for which sins was a generation being afflicted? Meaning if it's pick your own sin that caused the punishment, you could end up with sins that are exactly the opposite of each other and still be no better off at knowing what we are meant to do. That reading the tea leaves of suffering to understand God's will is a fool's errand because, well, we'll see the direct difference between the two. The late Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, leader of the Hasidic community of Satmar and himself a survivor of Bergen-Belsen, declared that the Holocaust was a punishment for Jewish political activism. The Jewish people had, according to the Talmud, this interpretation, taken an oath to wait patiently in exile until God himself redeemed them. But secular Zionism, in the eyes of the Hasidim, had broken this promise by forcing the course of Jewish history and bringing a premature ingathering to the Holy Land. The Shoah then was a punishment for Zionism, again, in the eyes of Rabbi Teitelbaum. So this is one of the great leaders of the Satmar community, one I vehemently disagree with. I just make sure that's very clear. But his opinion was, if you want to know why the Holocaust happened, it was God punishing us. And what was the sin that we were guilty of? It was the sin of daring to try and rebuild Israel in our lifetime, rather than waiting patiently in exile until some divine version of redemption took place, as though we could tell the difference. But that's my own problem with his general position. But for the moment, just understand that Rabbi Sachs is bringing him as one example of an attempt to figure out which sin it was that might have led to the Shoah, might have led to the Holocaust. However, that's not the only way we could understand the events. An Israeli thinker, Menachem Hartom, pursued the same logic, meaning it's divine punishment for our sin, to its opposite conclusion. That is to say, throughout its history, he argued, the Jewish people had regarded exile as punishment, as not being at home. That is to say, we were in galut, we are in exile, this is suffering, this is punishment, and therefore we yearned constantly to return home. That is, until emancipation. Until in the 1800s, depending upon which country, Jews began to get additional rights, additional freedoms, and additional measures of equality, again, varying from country to country. Then, for the first time, Jews argued that Europe was where they belonged. Indeed, this was the official plank in the early days of the Reform movement. No longer, but at the early days of the Reform movement, they specifically rejected any notion of the ingathering of the people or of the expectation of messianic redemption, that their European countries were their homes, first, foremost, and last, and there was no room in their heart for any other national aspiration. And many others had a similar attitude. Some abandoned the hope for a return to Israel, others deferred it to a metaphysical end of days. Indeed, that is what Teitelbaum was referring to. That yes, we hope to go back to Israel, but I don't hope to go back to the land of Israel where it sits on the globe today. I hope for the Messianic era to come when all of that is done for me. And in the meantime, I'm quite okay here in the diaspora. I'm quite okay here in exile. And I'll just sit very, very patiently until other things happen. That is to say, for the first time, Jews ceased to be Zionists. Zionist here in that narrow definition of believing that the Jews had a right to a homeland in the physical land of Israel at any moment. That was our constant yearning. And Menachem Hartom is saying we had given up on that dream because we were comfortable here or comfortable saying something would happen later. For giving up on the Zionism, they suffered a devastating retribution. Germany, the country more than any others that Jews had worshipped, became the avenger. The Shoah was a punishment for anti-Zionism. So Teitelbaum says that it was punishment for political Zionism, and Hartom says that it was a punishment for not being Zionistic enough. So if we're trying to figure out which sin caused the Shoah, we can come up with rationalizations for completely opposite sins and for thousands of others. Pick your sin, grind your axe, and claim that this was punishment for it, and I guess profit. That's the problem with this underlying logic, is that if you believe that every action is a punishment, then you may be no closer to figuring out what you did to earn God's wrath, and that will mean you have very little, well, surety of what you need to do to repair things. Obviously, people like Hartom and Teitelbaum and many others think they can speak for God, that they can have prophetic wisdom that will explain precisely what our crimes were, and thus be able to give absolutely incontrovertible divine guidance of what our next action should be. The only problem, of course, being that all the people who are so certain disagree with each other, which would either imply that all of them but one are wrong, or that they are all drawing from different gods, which is obviously impossible, or perhaps that they are all making it up in their best attempt to grapple with a terrible situation and try to figure out how to somehow make sense of this in a way that at least fits with their already hard-coded, hardwired beliefs. All right. But is that as bad as this punishment for sin motif can get? Oh, absolutely not. Worse than this contradiction, the Teitelbaum Hartom version, was the fact that traditional theodicy is the study of how God's justice works in the world and how bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, or the idea that everybody gets precisely what they deserve. So worse than that contradiction was the fact that traditional theodicy, superficial theodicy, could be used in Christian hands to justify the concentration camps as punishment for Jews for remaining Jews. In 1948, a mere 3 years after the Shoah, a German evangelical conference met at Darmstadt. I apologize for my German pronunciation, not my strong suit. It proclaimed that Jewish suffering in the Holocaust was the work of God. It issued a call to Jews to cease their rejection and ongoing crucifixion of Jesus. Genocide was the punishment for deicide. So let that sink in. This conference of German evangelicals argued that the Shoah was a divine punishment, not because we had drifted from Torah, but because we had stuck to it too stubbornly. That had we rejected Torah, had we embraced Jesus and the crucifixion as our own salvation, then it never would have happened and there would have been no problem. Now, obviously, this is factually wrong, as many Jews who had become Christian were still killed in the Holocaust because of their Jewish ancestry, if not their current Jewish beliefs. And many Jews who had left Judaism altogether, even without embracing Christianity, were also likewise murdered. But again, when you have a particular axe to grind, when you are still 2,000 years later blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus, then looking at the murders of the Holocaust and saying, well, they deserved it because they still haven't accepted Jesus, seems perfectly logical. It seems to make absolute sense within that worldview, provided you're not willing to be disturbed by the level of suffering that took place. But if you think your cause is the cause for which all suffering is certainly justifiable, then I guess that sits perfectly fine. Now, continuing in Rabbi Sachs's words, nor was this sentiment restricted to Christians who approved of the final solution, meaning not every Christian who was an actual supporter of the Nazi plan, not only were Christians who were supporters of the Nazi plan apt to use this they deserved it kind of logic. The great Christian theologian Karl Barth, himself an opponent of the Nazi regime, wrote during the Holocaust that the fate of the Jews was testimony to the stark judgment of God. This, he wrote, is how Israel punished itself for its sectarian self-assertion. And cutting away the eloquence of mid-century German writers, what he is saying there is, this is what you get for trying to be different. You see, if you hadn't made yourself so different, if you hadn't set yourself apart, then none of this would have happened. Don't you realize people are only anti-Semitic because they think you're weird? And you are weird? If you just stopped being weird, none of this would have happened. Certainly, that is a great way to absolve himself and his co-nationalists and co-religionists to the crime that came by their complicity in the Holocaust, that even if they stood against the Nazi regime, they had to admit its worst crimes weren't really their crimes or even the Nazis' crimes. They were the crimes of the Jews because they brought it on themselves. I mean, what did they expect? You know, if you walk down a dark alley in a dangerous city in a dangerous country and you've got money hanging out of your pockets, of course you're going to get robbed. I don't have any sympathy for you. That's what's going to happen. And likewise, If the Jews had just given up on their Judaism, or at the very least not been so different, then certainly this wouldn't have happened. So we can see from all four of these different opinions that there is a strong temptation from this superficial explanation of punishment, of curses, as being solely dependent upon the sins of the people who are suffering, that there is a wonderful self-satisfied path to take where you can pat yourself on the back and say, I understand why this happened. The victims deserved it. Here's what they did wrong. They killed Jesus. They made themselves too different. They weren't Zionist enough. They were too Zionist. You can come up with any explanation, and you let God completely off the hook. And as we'll see later, you also let the actual perpetrators off the hook. Because as soon as you say God's judgment was right, as soon as you say the destruction, the devastation, the curses that were carried out were appropriate, that they were commensurate with the crimes, whatever I've determined them to be, then not only have you exonerated God, but you have also exonerated the people who committed those crimes. Because after all, the person who knocks you on the head and robs you in that dark alley, well, he was just behaving as anybody would behave in that circumstance, and therefore his criminality is nothing really compared to whatever stupidity led you into that problem in the first place. So it is a complete flipping of actual justice, because not only are we saying that the person deserved it, we are also saying the person who perpetrated it is, well, fundamentally innocent in this case. The blame should be put somewhere else, most likely at the feet of the victim. Such theodicy, Rabbi Sachs continues, such theodicy, as the Christian theologian Roy Eckart has pointed out, inverts the values of God himself. It fails to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comforted. That if you're not helping people who are suffering, and you're not making the people who cause the suffering uncomfortable with what they're doing, then you are missing on part of our mission in life. It instead comforts the comforted and afflicts the afflicted. The people who commit the crimes feel fully justified in what they did, and the person who suffered feels like they must have somehow deserved it, and that isn't right. At some point, though, the religious imagination rebels against adding to the evil of their death the indignity of saying that it was justified. And this is where we reach our problem, that for many people, on an average day, when they hear about somebody who got fired from their job, they can easily think to themselves, maybe they weren't the best employee, maybe they didn't have the right skills, maybe they were difficult to work with, there might be some reason. It's a hard economic time, the company was downsizing, so it's not really anybody's fault, except maybe the person who got fired, that, somehow they are to blame. And we begin with a position of having to defend the person who has suffered that problem, rather than having to defend the decision to take away a person's livelihood. And we're unfortunately really good at that. We're really good at blaming those who are going through suffering, because it makes us feel that the world is working according to plan, that justice is happening more or less okay, or at least I can imagine that it's okay, and therefore I don't need to investigate any further, because God forbid I actually find out it's maybe not going the way I think it should. But at some point, as Rabbi Sachs points out, the amount of evidence of the injustice, of the magnitude of the suffering, of the piety of the victim becomes so enormous that we can no longer hide behind that concept. We can no longer say, oh, this is fine, that this is fair, that the person who suffered probably deserved it, at least in part. At a certain point, we just break down and say, no, I don't think so. Now, the big problem, of course, is that when a person breaks down in the face of this simplistic explanation of the suffering of the good people, the first solution they come to is to reject religion altogether. And that, of course, is a fundamental flaw, that just because people who claim the mantle of religiosity claim that this explains it, when you decide that they are wrong, it does not mean the religion for which they claim to speak is wrong. It just means they're wrong. That you need to fight to separate the status of the advocate from the status of the actual belief, the actual faith. Just because they seem to be approved as spokespeople for a particular faith does not mean they are 100% accurate in every description or determination of what's going on in the world. So it is easier and more appropriate to say that pastor, that rabbi, that writer, they're wrong, rather than saying there is no God or God is wrong. So how can we try to fix this while still remaining in the religious sentiment? Well, Rabbi Sachs is going to offer at least one explanation. And again, his whole book is on this topic, but this is one explanation from the same chapter, so it felt appropriate to bring. The Holocaust drew Jews back to their religious destiny as a holy people after the ravages of assimilation. The Talmudic sages, in a similar vein, had argued that the Messianic age would be preceded by collective repentance, and if nothing else brought this about, providence would send a ruler whose decrees will be as harsh as those of Haman, that is to say, to bring the Jews back to God. What joins Maz's, one of the other writers that he quotes that I didn't have room on the page for, what joined Maz's reading to those that trace a connection between the Holocaust and Israel is the insistence that events disclose their meanings only in retrospect. Unlike those who speak of sin and retribution, they attach significance to what follows the Shoah, not what preceded it. So, Rabbi Sachs's argument here and elsewhere in his works is that the Shoah is not justified as having been an appropriate punishment for appropriate sins. And thus he is not saying that those who perpetrated the crimes are off the hook because this was, after all, the correct amount of punishment, the same way that if somebody pulls the lever to execute a condemned person, we wouldn't call them a murderer if we believe that the justice that led to that person's execution was fair. Likewise, we are not looking at what led to the Holocaust, because we're not going to say that they deserved it, that this was essential for punishing what they had done. Instead, what Rabbi Sachs is arguing is that the Holocaust was essential because of what came next, that the Holocaust was preparing something else to follow, to significantly change the world in a way that was appropriate and good and right. And this was, if you will, the price of admission. Now, I vehemently disagree with Rabbi Sachs on this point. I think he is falling into the same fundamental error that the other readers that he was attacking with great clarity also fell into, which is to say that somehow it was worth it. The other rabbis and thinkers fell into the category of saying it was worth it because the Jews deserved it, for whatever reason from those that we've already discussed. Rabbi Sachs, on the other hand, is saying the Holocaust was worth it because of what it accomplished positively in the long run, and in particular, a deep return to Judaism in his mind of what Judaism should look like. That because there are more people now who are studying Torah than there were prior to the Holocaust, therefore, that was just the price of admission. That's what was necessary to force us away from assimilation. It wasn't because it was punishment. He is trying to split the hair there. It wasn't that punishment. It was just a necessary reprimand in order to properly move us in the right direction towards redemption, towards repentance. So that's where he gets this idea that our correct response should not be to uncover the justice of the punishment, but should instead uncover the necessity of teshuvah, of returning to God in strong fashion after this destruction, so that we will make the most of what has just happened. Now, that is in its own way a very common theme throughout Judaism. He gives a similar idea here, and of course, Yizkor and many other parts of our tradition have tried to make the most of what had happened. We try to learn from catastrophes and try to enshrine those lessons in our behaviors. But there is a difference between saying, this has happened, it was horrible, it never should have happened, and it's not worth the price, but since it happened, we're going to go ahead and make the most of it. And taking the position of Rabbi Sachs, which is, it's horrible, it's terrible, maybe it shouldn't have happened, but honestly, it's actually probably been helpful. So let's make the most of it because we did probably need it. Those are two fundamentally different perspectives, but they can look very similar. They can feel very similar depending upon the community or the leadership of that community. And as I said, this is a place where I disagree vehemently with Rabbi Sachs. I think that for all of his rhetoric, he is still essentially saying that had we been different, the Holocaust wouldn't have been needed. That is to say, if we had hearkened to God before without this catastrophe, then the catastrophe wouldn't have been needed to get our attention. If you had come the first time I called you, I wouldn't have had to start shouting. And if you had come when I shout, I wouldn't have had to go hit you. It's an explanation that justifies, well, just about anything you want to justify. Because again, it is shifting the blame ultimately on the people who were suffering the most. And his idea that we were suffering the ravages of assimilation, well, the ravages of assimilation is not a passive phrase. The ravages of assimilation are caused, in his mind, by Jews, meaning that had the Jews behaved differently, this would not have been necessary. And I find that problematic because it is still blaming them in a way that is exonerating the criminals that carried out and is saying that we accept this as being fair, if only because of what came after, even if we're not quite overtly saying because of what happened before. So these are many different approaches. Obviously, I haven't found my own satisfactory approach within these. I find that the words of Sforno, which we will finish off with, who's from the 1500s, and obviously was seeing great devastation in his own timeline, because, well, there has been great devastation at many points in our history, but certainly suffering after the expulsion from Spain in 1492 was really highlighting the fragility of Jewish life. So let's see how he takes this idea and whether there is perhaps a different approach. Again, it may not be perfect, it may not be entirely satisfactory, but it can still be illuminating. With these words, meaning the "and if you fail to keep," Moses introduces his admonitions, the ones which parallel chapter 26 in Leviticus, where there are other warnings, but are sounding far more devastating. A lot more detail here in Deuteronomy. Israel is described as backsliding, having, with the help of Torah legislation, been the front runner in civilized countries. Whenever the Torah speaks about the Jewish people abandoning the laws of the Torah, the intention is not to make us think that they slid into anarchy, but worse, they slid into adopting the laws of the prevalent cultures and civilizations. So when it says, if you keep my rules, don't just think people stopped obeying the laws against adultery or theft or what have you, that they just went neutral. It was instead that they were picking up the culture, the mores, the laws of other cultures and civilizations. Clearly, the adoption of an alternative version, is an even greater affront to God, the lawgiver, than merely being passive and not carrying out Torah legislation. Social legislation involving tithes was largely ignored. This is going back to the time of the Second Temple, leading to such great scholars as Hillel and the high priest Yochanan decreeing legalistic means of circumventing the legislation so that the people would not be guilty of violating such basic social laws as forgiving overdue debts at the end of the Shemitah year. This is the Prus Bowl that we talked about a little while ago. The rabbis, in a number of instances, were forced to preserve the spirit of the law, sometimes at the expense of what may be termed the letter of the law. This is all detailed throughout the Talmud and other rabbinic literature. The discontinuance of the examination by the priest of a woman suspected of marital infidelity, known as sota, is one such example, the bitter waters ritual. The rabbis feeling that when infidelity had become the norm rather than the exception, it would not do to demand a miracle from God every time such a situation arose. Moreover, the chances were that the husband's sexual life was not so free of blemish that he could point a finger at his wife. Other practices, such as referring disputes to pagan judges of the nations during Greek and Roman times, occupying Israel at the time, made it almost impossible for the Jewish judiciary, even when meaning to preside over Torah law, to be an effective legal instrument. If somebody is having a debate with their neighbor over a property line, over a debt, if they know that they can get a more favorable outcome by going to a Roman court than by going to the Jewish court, then they'll do that. They will avail themselves of whatever they think is most personally beneficial, even if it is destructive to us collectively. Therefore, all of these conditions became a self-fulfilling prophecy in the decline of the Jewish people as a holy nation, and led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of Jewish independence on a land of their own. All right, so in his analysis, the destruction of the Romans, which was the last great destruction up to his point, notwithstanding the tragedy of the Crusades and of the Spanish expulsion, that those were a self-fulfillment, that it wasn't that God was coming down to punish us for what we had done, but that instead, during those generations, we had created a society that did it to ourselves, that we created a nation that would decline and would rot from within, and that thus would be easily toppled at the hands of foreign adversaries, the same way other countries were routinely toppled by foreign adversaries for failing to have the strength and the personal integrity of a nation to withstand such threats. But importantly, he is not saying this is the explanation for all catastrophes, that the particular prophecy that is happening here in Deuteronomy and also in Leviticus is not saying every time there is a catastrophe, it is because we have sinned. It is saying that occasionally we will make the huge blunder of deliberately rejecting our Judaism in the favor of something else. And when we do that while we are in control of our own land, it will destroy our ability to maintain our presence in that land. That this is the explanation for the fall of the first temple and the second temple. But it is not saying every time every Jewish community suffers any catastrophe, such as the Crusades or the destruction from the Inquisition and the expulsion of Spain, that it is always because we deserved it. Sometimes it is because the other nations are behaving terrible, and we are simply their victims in their reign of terror. Not that we have earned it, but that they have chosen to perpetrate it. We have to come to an understanding that there are some elements of punishment and of suffering that indeed are brought about by our behaviors, that our actions do have consequences, often directly as a consequence of our deed, meaning no miraculous intervention is needed by God. If a person chooses to abuse their body with substances, the fact that their body suffers from those substances is not divine retribution. It's simple natural law of what happens when you choose to do that. But when there are the choices of others that impact upon us, when we have not been engaged in anything that would expedite or facilitate their reign of terror against us, then we have to instead think of it as the same thing as being when a random murderer picks a victim and kills them through no fault of their own. We would not blame that victim, or at least we should not, and we would instead lay all of the guilt at the feet of the person who committed the crime, at the murderer. Likewise, the Nazis are solely responsible, and those who supported and abetted them are solely responsible for the devastation that they wrought upon the Jewish people, upon the many other victims in the camps, as well as the rest of Europe who died in the tens of millions because of their crimes. No one had to earn that punishment, and nowhere do we need to believe that God was somehow behind or in favor of that punishment, neither as a necessary act of justice for our crimes, nor as a necessary entry point for some blessing that was just around the corner. Instead, we can say they were wrong for perpetrating their crimes against innocent people, and innocent people can suffer at the hands of the wicked through no crime of those innocent people. The entire book of Job teaches us this, as well as many other parts of the Tanakh. And we are well served not to look at the Shoah and scratch our head figuring out how to blame ourselves. Instead, to look at the Shoah and figure out how best to understand how the crimes of the Nazis were able to begin, able to continue, and able to be supported for so long in such a monstrous way. And if we can understand that better, then we will be able to prevent such crimes from ever being perpetrated again, and remain passionate in our devotion to our faith, which teaches us that those crimes were crimes, that injustice was injustice, and that those criminals are the only that must be held accountable. Like I said, there is so much more to continue to discuss, debate, and understand from all of this topic. It is not going to be solved in an hour. God forbid you think I am proposing that. But hopefully this will give you some idea that when we are reviewing our own lives in preparation for this holiday of Rosh Hashanah, which is rapidly approaching, that we reflect, yes, that some of the things we have done have been wrong, and some of the things done to us have also been wrong. We have not deserved every problem that we have faced, nor are we guiltless for every problem that we have caused. And being able to differentiate between those two is the first step towards being able to be accountable for our own behavior, as well as holding others accountable for their behavior as well. And with that, I wish everybody an early Shana Tova, have a wonderful new year, but that new year comes because of doing the hard work, not waving our hands and saying everything's fine. Take care, everyone, and be well.